is still so many unknowns around this virus.
Not only will America dig itself out of this hole they put us in, we're going to build back, and we're going to build back better.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Tumulty. I'm a columnist here at the Washington Post, and we are absolutely delighted that you could join us this afternoon for our Post Live coverage during this convention week. And we are also delighted to have as our guest this afternoon, Ambassador Susan Rice, who was National Security Advisor in the second Obama term in office, and before that was UN Ambassador. So welcome, Ambassador Rice, and also congratulations on your new best-selling book, Tough Love.
Thank you, Karen. It's great to be with you. Good afternoon, everyone.
So this is a convention unlike any other that we've ever seen, forced by circumstance that way. So how do you think it's going? And specifically, what did you think of Senator Harris's acceptance speech last night?
Well, I think the whole convention has been really quite good and much better than certainly I would have expected. And we didn't really know what to expect, but I find the virtual format to be very personal, very compelling, and very human. And so every night I've found myself excited and pleasantly surprised at how much substance is in it and how much we're really getting a feel for the issues and the challenges and the hopes of everyday Americans, and the showcasing of this nation's extraordinary diversity and complexity, the themes of unity and together we can prevail, I think are absolutely appropriate. And every night I've found inspiring. Last night was tremendous, of course, between President Obama and Senator Harris, among so many others. It really was a remarkable evening. I thought Senator Harris gave a great speech, as one would have expected. And we got a better sense of who she is and what motivates her and where she came from, her sort of origin story, but also the issues that animate her, and the passion and the commitment that I think she'll bring to the job and to the campaign. So I think it was definitely a winning evening for her and for the ticket, and I believe for the country.
And your name, of course, was on the short list during the whole selection process. In fact, your name was on the very, very short list during this selection process. What do you think finally turned the choice in the end for Vice President Biden?
Well, I can't speak for Vice President Biden, of course, but I must say it was my honor and quite humbling to be among what it was an extraordinary group of women who were considered through this process. I think Vice President Biden had to weigh a wide range of factors. Each of us brought particular strengths and perhaps particular liabilities. And he made a choice that we all support, that we're all excited by, that will, I think, give us a great chance to win in November, which I believe we will, and then to be able to go about the very challenging task of governing in a context when so many challenges await the next president, and when so much damage has been done domestically and internationally to our competency and capacity. So I'm hopeful. I think he made a great choice. And I certainly will join with all of the women who are under consideration in doing our utmost to try to get Joe Biden and Kamala Harris elected.
Well, one of the things that is so striking, there is so much right now going on in the world outside the convention hall that really shaping, I think, the themes that we've heard this week, both of the sort of dark place that the country is in, and also Vice President Biden's capacity to lead it out of that. You've talked before about how the Obama administration had shaped a strategy for dealing with a pandemic like the one that the country is dealing with now. And you've criticized the Trump administration for not paying attention to that plan. If Vice President Biden becomes President Biden, what do you think, with that sort of plan in mind, ought to be the first 2 or 3 things that his administration would have to do to get the COVID-19 epidemic under control?
Well, Karen, unfortunately, if we're lucky enough to have Joe Biden as our next president in January, it will have been a year since this crisis first arose. And many of the steps that would have been wise to take at the outset will be trains that have already left the station. But the things that will still matter, assuming that we are much in the same place as we are today, are first of all having clear, science-driven, fact-based communication and leadership from the top, not a bunch of lies and distractions and quackery, but a leader in the White House who communicates clearly on things like the necessity of wearing masks. Joe Biden has called for a national mask mandate, which I think is frankly overdue. We'll have clarity about the necessity of prioritizing, bending the curve, and keeping it down in jurisdictions across the country as a prerequisite for responsibly and sustainably reopening the economy, and more importantly, enabling our kids to go back to school safely. We will hopefully be in a position to be wrestling with the question of how best to disseminate what we hope will be a safe and effective vaccine. Dr. Fauci and others are saying that we could have the beginnings of that early in 2021. Let's hope so. But then we're going to face enormous challenges as to who gets it first and how we ensure that it is rolled out and provided to Americans in a fashion that is both rational and fair, but also maximally protective. And then, Karen, the third thing is people have to understand that it's not sufficient for the United States to successfully vaccinate the bulk of its population, which itself will be extraordinarily difficult. We've got to see that vaccine globally disseminated as widely as possible, because vaccines prevent diseases, but diseases don't respect borders. And if this disease, COVID-19, remains prevalent in other far-flung parts of the world, it could well mutate and come back and infect Americans again. So we cannot be satisfied with simply a domestic response to this, which has been one of the great failures of the Trump administration. And then finally, Karen, the need for much more widely available rapid testing and contact tracing is not going to go away. And that failure is sort of one of the original sins of this whole pandemic in terms of how the United States and the White House has handled it. We have got to get far ahead of the testing imperative, finally.
There's, as I said, so much else going on this week. And there was another piece of news that I think if we were living in anything close to a normal time, we would be talking about nothing else. And that was the Senate Intelligence Committee finally puts out its report on Russian efforts to interfere with our election in 2016. Was there anything in that report that surprised you?
As much as I know about Russian interference in the 2016 election, yes, I mean that report was really remarkable in a number of ways. First of all, 1,000 pages. And the mandate of the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee in producing its bipartisan report was not to do what Mueller did, which was to look for criminal activity, but to really get underneath the story of what happened from an intelligence point of view and also from a counterintelligence point of view. And what that report detailed, even to a greater extent than the Mueller report, was the breadth and the depth of the contacts, communication, coordination between those involved in the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence operatives, which is quite extraordinary. And so what this report does is detail the nature and the breadth of those contacts. And call into question the veracity of the testimony that the president provided pursuant to the Mueller investigation under oath, and many other things that had not been so clearly articulated and plainly revealed until recently.
And it was beyond looking backward. How convinced are you that Russia is still out there trying to do these sorts of things as we are closing in on the final stretch to our elections this November?
I almost never say this, Karen, but 100% convinced that Russia is doing much of what it did in 2016 and certainly more. And what's different now, first of all, the intelligence community, as it did in 2016, has now recently come out with a very clear statement of what Russia's doing. It got a little bit muddied up by trying to conflate what China and Iran may be doing, which is completely different and on a far lesser scale and in the public domain relative to what Russia's doing covertly and very perniciously. But we need to be worried about not only Russian disinformation, its activity on social media, which is constant, aimed at misleading and dividing and instilling fear and hatred between and among Americans. But we need to be concerned also about what efforts it may make again to try to infiltrate our voting systems and corrupt either our voting rolls or even potentially the voting count itself. That's very hard to do, and hopefully in the intervening years, even more steps have been taken to harden our systems. I believe in many cases that's the case, but I also think the Russians aren't going to stop trying. And then the other thing that I'm deeply concerned about is what we have seen in front of our very eyes over the last couple of years, which is presidential envoys like Rudy Giuliani actively and openly soliciting bogus information to weaponize against Donald Trump's opponent, in this case, Joe Biden, and soliciting that false information from Russian-backed Ukrainian operatives. And doing so, it would appear now, with the support and the added engagement of senators like Ron Johnson and his committee that seem to be part of this scheme this time, which is truly extraordinary. So it's not just the Russians, it's not just the Trump campaign and those involved with it. It's also now at least a handful of Republicans in the Senate who seem to be willing to sully themselves with Russian propaganda in order to advantage Donald Trump again in this election.
And yet, as you mentioned, the Senate Intelligence Committee is run by Republicans, as the entire Senate is. So do you think that this 1,000-page report, again, something where the Republicans themselves were the primary drivers behind it, is going to make any kind of difference in sort of where the party is oriented? Because we do have a president who keeps talking about all of this as a hoax and a fantasy and just purely politically driven. So will this report make any difference?
Well, I think it will make a difference in the following sense. First of all, it was a bipartisan report that was the product of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which thus far has largely remained apolitical, unlike its counterpart in the House when led by Devin Nunes. Yes, the Republicans were the majority on that committee. They signed on to it, and I give them real credit for the substance of that report and the Democrats who served with them on that committee. But then you get to the aftermath where you can read the report, and the report's very factual, very substantive, and then there's the spin that went with the release of the report. Which really, frankly, contradicted the substance of the report. Leaving that aside, I think that for those who ought to be and are rightly concerned about the real threat of foreign interference again in our democratic processes, this report should add greater clarity to the nature of the tactics and open eyes to the concerns. But I'm more concerned that what is likely to happen is that, at least on the Republican side, that there's a impulse to look the other way at best, or to put lipstick on a pig, as Marco Rubio did in his characterization of the findings of the report, all in an effort to change the subject just at the time that we need to be focused on this threat most directly. And then, Karen, the other thing is we can't look at what Russia's doing and what the Trump campaign may be doing to encourage Russian involvement in isolation. It's of a piece. Combine that with Donald Trump, calling into question the validity of the results, saying if he doesn't win, it's got to be because of fraud. That is the height of anti-democratic authoritarian policy. It's exceedingly dangerous to our democracy. His threats to mail-in voting, his threats to the post office, you add all of these things together, calling in the troops to urban areas in order to use violence against peaceful protesters. This is all a dangerous series of tactics that, taken together, pose a very serious threat to the integrity of our democracy.
Well, there's also, at least what I think is a very possible scenario, that we are not going to know who the winner of this election is on election day. You look at Arizona in 2018, a number of the candidates who were ahead on election night, fell behind as the mail-in ballots started coming in. And Arizona, in fact, itself could be, a determining state this time. But the president keeps saying over and over, if we don't know who the winner is by the time we hit bedtime on election night, that there's going to be fraud involved, that, this is not because they're carefully counting the votes, it's because somebody's rigging it. I mean, what do you, as you look forward, if in that kind of scenario, say it takes another week to come up with the winner of this, what is sort of life going to be like for all of us?
Well, I think Americans should expect, absent any extenuating circumstances, that it will not be on the night of November 3rd that we know the results. That for a variety of reasons, it will legitimately take additional time to come to a legitimate conclusion. And we have to be patient. We have to look at what's happened, not just in Arizona in the past, and a number of other states like California, where a number of congressional races take weeks to get decided, but what we've seen in the primary process, exacerbated by the pandemic, by fewer polling stations, by greater reliance on voting by mail. We have to be patient, and we have to recognize that it is likely the case that we won't know the results for some while after November 3rd, and we've got to be patient in that regard.
Could I turn to sort of the United States and its place these days on the world stage? The administration chalked up what a lot of people regarded with a win and got a very big embarrassing loss this week. The win being the peace deal with Israel and UAE, the loss being their effort in the United Nations, your old stomping grounds, to extend the Iran sanctions. Whoever succeeds Donald Trump, whether it is in January or 4 years after January, is going to inherit a situation where the United States has a very different place in the world among its allies and among its adversaries. How big of a challenge is that going to be, or would it just be fixed by having somebody else in the White House, or is there other work that's going to have to be done?
The challenge is huge, Karen, and electing Joe Biden, who is known to our friends and adversaries around the world, who's experienced, who's sober, who has good judgment and personal relationships, and the ability to put the national interest where it belongs, which is at the forefront, is necessary. Electing Joe Biden is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's going to require as well a great deal of patience and humility and hard work on behalf of the entirety of the new administration to try to put back together, most importantly, our core alliance relationships and partnerships around the world that have suffered immeasurable damage in terms of loss of trust, a sense that we no longer share interests, that we have abandoned our values. And then we also have to right our relationships with our adversaries who have enjoyed extraordinary leeway and benefits under Donald Trump. This has been the best 4 years for China of almost any in its modern history. Russia, who interferes daily in our democracy, is being protected by Donald Trump for reasons that we still don't fully understand. Kim Jong-un is a recipient of love letters while his nuclear program has persisted and his missile program. So there is a great deal of work to be done to renew and refresh our leadership role in the world. I believe we can do it, but I believe we have to be, realistic about the amount of time it will take and the damage that's been done. And it begins with our allies and partners. It also begins in places like the United Nations, where it's an utter embarrassment that we put forward a resolution on Iran last week, and the only country in the Security Council that voted with us was the Dominican Republic. Everybody else either abstained or opposed it. And today, Mike Pompeo is about to launch an even more dangerous gambit at the UN in New York, related to Iran again, seeking to snap back sanctions on Iran, even though the United States is the one that pulled out of the deal in 2018 and violated its terms in the first instance. Nobody is going to support us in that regard either, and it is going to call into question our ability to sustain the all crucial veto power that we have in the United Nations, and it will do potentially irreparable damage to any prospect of containing Iran's nuclear program.
Could I back you up a little bit? You mentioned China, and you said this has been the best 4 years for China in a very long time. One of the major lines of attack that the Republicans seem to have on Vice President Biden is that he's too soft on China. Could you explain why you believe these last 4 years have been good for China, and what you think how Vice President Biden would change that relationship?
The reason why the last 4 years have been so good for China is because the United States under Donald Trump has done its utmost to undermine our alliance relationships in Asia and in Europe. And China wants nothing more than to see our alliance structures dismantled. That has been a long-standing geostrategic goal of China, and Donald Trump has played directly into their hands. So now, when China misbehaves in the South China Sea, or steals our intellectual property, or engages in trade practices that we find highly detrimental to our interests, rather than facing the United States in close alignment with its Asian and European allies to push back on China, we've gone it alone. And the greatest example of that is in the trade sphere, where Donald Trump invested all kinds of effort and energy into what is largely a hollow trade agreement at the expense of our farmers and manufacturers, and could have gotten a great deal more had he worked with our Asian and European allies to put combined economic pressure on China. Instead, he started bilateral trade wars with the Europeans and the Canadians and others over issues that are of far lesser significance. And so that is emblematic of the way in which he has mismanaged the relationship with China, not to mention his praise for Xi Jinping, admiring his aspirations to be dictator for life, turning the other way and green lighting violence against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province and against peaceful protesters in Hong Kong. We've had a bifurcated message out of this administration. The White House, with its, largely positive rhetoric towards China, including calling on China to interfere in our elections, and the State Department and other agencies with a tougher line. And the net sum of all of that is that we are further behind on our economic agenda and in our strategic relationship with the Asia Pacific region and the world in general. And China's position has been enhanced. And one last example, we walked out of the World Health Organization out of pique at the way we claimed it managed the coronavirus with respect to China. But by walking away, we ceded the entirety of the leadership in that organization to China. And that's sort of also an example of how we've handled it. If we don't like something, Donald Trump takes his marbles and goes home. But he's just leaving the field wide open to China and China's interests and China's values, which are antithetical to our own.
So beyond rebuilding the relations with our allies and perhaps taking a longer term view to our relations with China, a longer term, because they certainly have a long term view about their place in the world, and these trade wars really are, short term tactics. What would you like to see Vice President Biden do early on to sort of reset the relationship with China itself?
Well, understand that Joe Biden has a long history with China. He has been firm when he's traveled to China, calling them out on their human rights abuses on Chinese soil. He was instrumental in the effort to obtain what we accomplished under the Obama administration, which was a serious agreement that for years imposed effective restraints on China's cyber theft of American intellectual property. It was the Obama administration that implemented the rebalance to Asia and the repositioning and increase in U.S. forces in the Asia Pacific. All of those things will be elements of what Joe Biden brings, but a great deal more, because obviously things have changed since 2016. And when it comes to China, in addition to working with our allies and having an appropriate force posture and being clear on the threat that China poses economically and strategically, we have to get our own house in order. Our strength with China begins with our own R&D, our own significant investments in the technologies of the future, whether it's clean energy or artificial intelligence, which China is trying to beat us on. When we have an immigration system that closes us off from vital talent that we customarily benefit from coming from the rest of the world, we are putting ourselves at a strategic disadvantage. So a lot of what we have to do is here on the domestic front to maintain and enhance our global competitiveness in these industries of the future. And then we also need to be faithful to our values and stand up for human rights, as Joe Biden has traditionally done and will do yet again with China. So it's a multifaceted set of actions that we need to take. We're going to rebuild American industry and be very clear about ensuring that, critical supplies like medical supplies and other things, we are not overly reliant on any country, but particularly China, to procure, because we're going to make them here at home. So for all of the bluster and rhetoric that we've heard out of Donald Trump, all the banging of the table in a trade war that has yielded virtually nothing for the American worker and American farmer, we have the opportunity to approach this relationship smarter, more effectively, with our domestic house in order and our allies behind us.
And with as many challenges as we have here at home, economically, a pandemic, all the things, foreign policy, at least on a substantive level, other than President Trump calling this the China virus 10 times a day, but on a substantive level, foreign policy has not gotten a lot of attention in this campaign season. Is there a part of the world or an issue that you think that we as a country, we as an electorate are taking our eye off of, something we really ought to be paying more attention to?
Well, there are many issues around the world, Karen, that we ought to be paying more attention to. But I think that the biggest ones relate to China, relate to Russia and its efforts to undermine our democracy, and climate change, which is a huge, looming existential threat, which this administration has exacerbated and accelerated. And then, of course, the pandemic is a national security issue as well as a domestic issue. We were unprepared because Donald Trump refused to use the tools that were available to him that we left him to utilize. He denied the severity of the virus. He never put in place the testing mechanisms. He reopened the economy prematurely. He's championed sending our students back to schools and putting them and our teachers at risk. He's basically done everything wrong. And as I mentioned earlier, has not had any global component to our response to the coronavirus, which is essential over the medium term if we are going to prevent this virus from coming back and reinfecting us here in the United States. So all of these issues are top priorities. They don't necessarily merit the airtime that they might get in another circumstance during the pandemic and an economic crisis, apart from the pandemic itself. But we can't lose sight of the fact that this is an extremely consequential election, not only to enable the United States to lead again in the world as a respected, trusted player, but also to put the appropriate pressure on China that is necessary to advance and secure our interests, to be clear-eyed about the Russian threat, to deal with other issues like North Korea, which Donald Trump is allowed to become worse, but also to deal with the primary threats that affect countries all over the planet, like climate change, which Donald Trump has absolutely no interest in addressing.
Well, because I am a political columnist, I am going to have to ask you the question that you probably are getting tired of being asked, but there really is no one with your resume. I didn't even mention the fact that you were an assistant secretary of state for Africa during the Clinton years. If you became secretary of state in a Biden administration, I think that would be the most unsurprising choice possible. How interested are you in playing a role in a Biden administration, and what role would you like to play?
Well, guess what? Joe Biden gets to make that decision, and I'll leave it to him to do so. I've been clear that my interest is in doing everything I possibly can to help Joe Biden and Kamala Harris become elected and take over leadership in January of 2021. I also will do my utmost to help us flip the Senate, because that's critically important, as well as holding the House. And if Joe Biden thinks that I can be a helpful member of his team in a new administration, then I'd be delighted to contribute. And I obviously I've spent many years in the State Department and working on national security and foreign policy at the White House as well. So the national security agencies are places that I'm very familiar with. But I would serve in any role that he thinks would be helpful to his team. And that's always what's motivated me, whether, having the privilege of being considered for vice president or serving in any other capacity. I just want the team to succeed.
Well, with that answer, Ambassador Rice, I'm thinking you must be a diplomat. Thank you.
No,
Our time has.
Had to, but
Our time.
no, I'm a diplomat.
Well, our time unfortunately has run out, and we do hope that you come back and join us here again soon on Post Live. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
You too. Stay healthy.
You too.
And up next, it'll be just a minute or so. my colleague Bob Costa will be interviewing Senator Chris Coons, who, by the way, took Joe Biden's place in the Senate when he left. So we will, and later today at 3:30, Bob will speak with Senator Bernie Sanders, and I will be interviewing Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. You can head over to WashingtonPostLive.com to register for any of this, and thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon. I'm not Bob Costa. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to Washington Post Live's continuing coverage of the Democratic National Convention. My guest is a good friend of Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. As Karen Tumulty just said a moment ago, he took Joe Biden's seat in the U.S. Senate. Chris Coons, Senator Coons, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be on with you.
And it's great to actually to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. There's been a lot of breaking news in the last couple of hours. We learned today that former Trump campaign manager Steve Bannon has been indicted on fraud charges related to fundraising for a border wall. Earlier in the week, we had the Senate intelligence report about Paul Manafort, the chairman of the president's 2016 campaign. The one who first advanced the theory that it was Ukraine interfering in the presidential election in 2016. And then today we had news from Manhattan that the Manhattan district attorney is able to subpoena the president's financial records. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but you're a member of the U.S. Senate. Give me your reaction on the breaking news, those two pieces of breaking news from today.
Well, Jonathan, the fourth piece that I would add to that is the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, who has been a persistent critic of Putin's leadership of Russia, an anti-corruption crusader and a democracy activist who was on a flight from the Far East in Russia to Moscow, and his plane had to land. He's now in a coma and in critical condition, believed to have been poisoned. He would not be the first of Putin's critics to be murdered on the steps of the Kremlin or poisoned in the UK or within Russia. And it is just a reminder, as is the final report from the Senate Intelligence Committee that you just referenced, a committee chaired by Republicans, a committee report signed off on by the committee members of both parties that makes it clear that the GRU, Russian military intelligence, had disturbingly close contacts with the most senior levels of the Trump campaign in 2016. Jonathan, looking forward, my concern is that there are plenty of warnings that Russia intends to and is trying to interfere with our elections this fall. And as someone who just went and visited the postal handling facility, the mail handling facility here in Newcastle, Delaware yesterday, and saw a very large dismantled automatic mail sorting machine out in the garbage, in the trash behind the building, exposed to the elements for days now. We've got efforts by the Trump administration, by a major donor to his campaign and a hand-picked postmaster general who has taken efforts to try and interfere with our election from within this country. So I'm concerned about the security and sanctity of our election this fall, one that we should be able to conduct safely in the middle of a pandemic. It's something I've worked hard in the Senate to provide additional financial resources to state election commissioners and boards at the state and county level, and to make sure that we've invested in protecting against cyber attacks. So that's just one quick tour of a couple of different aspects of the questions you asked on the news of the day.
Right, and it was a lengthy tour. But speaking of the post office, correct me if I'm wrong, the Postmaster General is testifying tomorrow before the Senate, correct?
Yes, I believe he is. In front of the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate, and I believe Monday in front of the Oversight Committee in the House.
In the House. And as I was listening to you talk about your visit to the postal facility there in Newcastle, I'm wondering, and people watching might be wondering, what, if anything, can Congress do to stop what the Postmaster General has already done?
Well, first, he
And
has
plans
made
to
a
do.
public commitment to stop what he's done. The point about the machinery being out exposed to the elements is how difficult it will be to reverse what he's done. Even if there is some commitment confirmed in writing, presented at testimony tomorrow and Monday to stop what he's doing, reversing it is going to be the challenge, making sure that there is the overtime personnel available, that the blue collection boxes that have been taken up, and the mail handling equipment that's been disassembled, ensuring that there is the capacity to handle the expected surge in mail associated with the election is critical. So that's going to require additional funding. That's going to require additional operational decisions by the Postmaster General. And I think pressure from the House and the Senate has made a real difference. But frankly, Jonathan, there's another important pressure. I've gotten 2,000 phone calls and emails from irritated Delawareans because they're a veteran and their medication from the VA is late. They're a small business owner and they can't send and receive checks in a timely fashion. They're a senior and they're concerned about their Social Security check, or they've sent a birthday card to a grandchild and it wasn't received for 2 weeks. The ways in which this Trump administration friend, Postmaster General DeJoy, altered the delivery schedules and the timing of mail was immediately noticed across the country. That agitation by average citizens is going to create pressure on Senate Republicans to act. And in the end, that's why I think we're going to see a reversal of the decline in delivery standards.
Senator Coons, I know you are a man of faith. You went to Yale Divinity School. You believe in the power of God. Do you really think, given what we've seen over the last 3.5 years, that Senate Republicans actually will respond to pressure from constituents upset about the post office, given what appears to be their total fear of President Trump in his Twitter feed?
You're right, Jonathan, to point out that there is an uneasy balance between what many Republicans know is right, what their constituents tell them is right, and their blind loyalty to President Trump. We've seen time and time again where Trump does or says things that are violating all sorts of our rules or norms, or as he did yesterday when he embraced this QAnon conspiracy theory, he says and does things that are just wacky. I mean, they're just way outside traditions and norms for any president's behavior, and yet they remain loyal to him. To believe in the Almighty, to believe in the power of prayer is to believe it is possible for there to be change, even when behavior right in front of you suggests it's unlikely. So I think we need to, what's that old phrase from Ronald Reagan? Trust but verify. I'll use a different phrase. You know, we need to pray for change, believe in change, and yet work for it, and demand accountability. I'll remind you, it was our shared dear friend, Congressman John Lewis. You traveled with John on congressional pilgrimages that I joined to Alabama. It was John Lewis who saw the possibility of change in this nation, even when his childhood in Troy, Alabama, growing up under brutal racist segregation, there was no reason for him to believe that peaceful protest could actually change the hearts and minds of the white majority in the South, could change the attitudes and intentions of senators in Congress, and could lead to legislative change. It is possible for there to be change, but it only happens when we work for it, when we call out inappropriate actions, when we demand change, and then when we act for it.
Well, Senator, one person who is working for change is your longtime friend, the Democratic presidential nominee in 2020, Joe Biden. What do you think right now of his chances of actually defeating President Trump on November 3rd?
I'm optimistic, but I think this will be a tough election. I think if we know anything about Donald Trump, it's that he will stop at nothing to win re-election. Remember, he was impeached. Many of us in the Senate voted for his removal because of actions he took to try and gin up some story in opposition to Joe Biden. So he will not respect traditional norms and boundaries. He's already said he won't automatically accept the results of the election. He makes comments on Twitter and in public daily that he thinks the election will be rigged. So I expect him to resist accepting the results of the election. I do think Joe Biden stands a strong chance of being elected by the popular vote. But as we heard, both from former Secretary Clinton and from former President Obama, sometimes winning the popular vote is not enough. And we need voters because of the Electoral College will be decisive. We need to have a turnout that breaks through any possible close call and makes it clear. In my view, one of the most important moments of the last few years was in 2018 when the gavel of the House of Representatives was handed over to Congresswoman, now Speaker Pelosi. That was a peaceful transition of power. We had gotten all sorts of dire warnings in the weeks ahead of that of Russian interference, of possible voter problems, voter fraud, voter challenges. And yet there was such an overwhelming majority in terms of the election of Democrats in the House of Representatives that transfer happened peaceably. I remain hopeful that may happen after this November 3rd's election, that we may see an orderly transition of power. But again, we have to be clear-eyed about the ways in which President Trump is day in and day out signaling that he has no intention of leaving easily or of refusing to contest and accept the results of this election.
Senator, you're going to be introducing Joe Biden before he gives his acceptance speech. I know you don't want to give too much away, but give us a sense of what you want to convey in your remarks tonight.
Well, I'll tell you what is the central point, which is that I've known Joe Biden for 30 years, and I know him to be a man of faith. I know him to be someone who in private moments of both joy and celebration and of deep loss and of grief turns to God in prayer. And that I've seen that impact how he treats others, his empathy, his kindness, the way that even as Vice President of the United States, if he encounters someone who shares with him a story of loss or anxiety or of grief, he gives them a shoulder to cry on or a partner in prayer, or he shares his personal cell phone number with them. Fred Gutenberg is someone who spoke at the convention. I got to meet and know Fred earlier this year in Orlando, and he told a compelling story. His daughter was murdered in Parkland, Florida. She was a high school student who was gunned down. He was a suburban Republican businessman, uninterested in and disengaged from politics. And when Joe Biden called him to offer his condolences on that tragic and terrible day, his initial response was, "That was nice, but I'll never hear from him again." Joe Biden called him back and called him back and called him back over months until Fred realized he was sincere, he was genuine, he was concerned, and he was engaged with him. That's the Joe Biden I want people to know about. And I want him to recognize that although his own Roman Catholic faith inspires his public service and his commitment to key social justice issues like combating racism, like having a more humane immigration policy, like addressing climate change, that he will be a president for all Americans, that he respects and welcomes and recognizes people of good conscience who practice no particular faith and people of all faiths. You know, Jonathan, folks in my party, Democrats, have long had a problem talking about how our faith inspires our service because we don't want to be disrespectful to humanists or to people of other faith traditions. I think it's long past time for us to step forward and say that in this election, as it has been in previous elections, there are religious issues on the ballot, such as how we address racism and racial inequality, how we address climate change or immigration, where it's okay for us to say that our perspectives on these issues are rooted in our faith. It's led us to progressive political goals rather than folks who for decades now have said that their conservative theology lines up with a conservative political agenda. They are not the only people of faith in our country. And I'm hoping tonight to introduce to Americans of faith who are uncertain whether the Democratic Party sees them, values them, or welcomes them, that they are.
You listening to your answer, you remind me of former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who not made a point of wearing his faith on his sleeve, but he was unashamed, unabashed, and just openly talking about faith, not willing to cede the field of faith solely to Republicans. Do you think, or do you worry that that kind of talk, if you will turn off Democratic voters for whom the separation of church and state is something they take super seriously.
Well, Jonathan, I think it was important to have Mayor Buttigieg talk about his service to our nation as a veteran, his service and leadership of a city, and his marriage and his faith, and how all of that makes him a complete person. You can't really understand Mayor Pete's skills and capabilities, his leadership and his priorities without understanding his faith. But he was far from alone on the presidential campaign stage during the primaries. Elizabeth Warren also talked about growing up in a family of faith, being a Sunday school teacher. Cory Booker often cited passages from scripture, both Christian, Jewish, and other scriptural sources. And Joe Biden is someone who, although quite private about his faith, it has informed him. To your question, Jonathan, I do think it's important that we make it clear that we respect the separation of church and state, that we see and respect and welcome non-theists, humanists, people who are good people who contribute to our society and are part of our politics, but are not part of an organized religion, and that we respect and recognize the tens of millions of Americans who are spiritual, who have prayer practices and spiritual practices, but who have been harmed by or turned off by or distanced by organized religion. Finding a way to convey that our priorities, that our values, that our politics are rooted in the faiths of those of us who are raised in certain faith traditions, but that we are respectful of the separation of church and state and welcoming to those who are from a wide range of faith traditions or who have no religious tradition. That is a challenge, but one we shouldn't shy away from. Jonathan, for too long, we've simply been silent and allowed our political opponents to project into that silence an absence of values and an absence of priorities. I think one of the most important religious issues on the ballot this fall is white supremacy and the founding sin of this nation, which was slavery. And I don't know how any minister, rabbi, priest, person of faith could disagree that if we honestly are going to see each other as children of God and treat each other as neighbors, we have to confront and address this nation's racist history.
Well, you're not going to get any disagreement from me on that. Let's talk about something, not a rift, but a tension in the party that is present and front of mind, and that is the progressive wing of the party. Do you have any concerns that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is not 100% behind Joe Biden?
Jonathan, I have never seen my party as united as they are right now. The range of folks who spoke, who endorsed Joe, who cheered for him, both in the last months of the campaign and during this convention, is broader and stronger than I've seen at any point in my life. And my first convention was in 1988. So I've been at this just a couple of years. I mean, who else other than Joe Biden could have gotten Bernie Sanders and John Kasich, both former presidential candidates of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and of the center-right faction of the Republican Party, speaking in one voice this week? I do think it's important for progressives to look clearly about what the alternatives are. Those were Bernie's remarks, essentially, if I could try and summarize them. Senator Sanders said that he knows clearly the costs and consequences for our nation of 4 more years of Donald Trump as president, and he is enthusiastically supporting Joe Biden and will work hand in hand with the Biden-Harris administration. Look at the process that produced our platform. Look at the process that produced the policy positions of the Biden campaign, and I think you'll see the most unified Democratic Party of my adult lifetime.
One more question on this. I agree with you. I see it and I sense it that the Democratic Party is more unified than it's ever been for as long as I've been covering politics. But is that because they are full square behind Joe Biden, or because they are full square behind getting rid of Donald Trump?
Well, the two are intimately connected. If our nominee is not elected president, there's no reasonable way to expect that we're going to get rid of Donald Trump. So the two are closely intertwined. When we get to January, if Joe Biden's president, Kamala Harris is vice president, and we happen to have control of the House and the Senate, I expect some of those policy differences will reemerge. but we know who Joe Biden is. We know what his heart is. We know his empathy, compassion, and concern for the American people. And he knows that this moment is going to call for bold action. If he becomes president, he will do so in the midst of three crises at the same moment: a global public health pandemic, the bungled handling of which by President Trump has produced a deep and long recession, and both of which have had an unequal impact on Black and brown communities across our country. We will have to do bold things to move this country forward, and I will be head of the line, extending my hand to Republicans saying, work with us, let's make progress together. If they refuse to do so, we'll have some hard choices about how to proceed. But I'll be following in Joe Biden's footsteps in using the relationships I've built, the bipartisan bridges I've built to try and make progress as soon as possible after the election.
Now, you're also on the ballot this November. You're running for your second full term in the Senate. Do you think that in the 117th Congress, you'll be in the majority in the Senate? Do the Democrats actually have a shot at overtaking the majority?
We do actually have a shot. It's gotten better as conditions in the country have gotten worse, and as it's been clearer and clearer that it was Donald Trump's failed leadership that has contributed to the suffering of so many Americans. So, frankly, we've got a great field of candidates. They are running against some seasoned incumbents who are capable candidates themselves, but our candidates are out raising them. They are out electioning. They are out campaigning their opponents, and poll after poll shows that we are likely to pick up seats in Arizona, in Colorado, in Montana, in Maine, in North Carolina. One of the challenges that I'll face, Jonathan, is that means some of the folks I've worked well with in terms of legislation will be former senators, but it also means that those joining this new Democratic majority will be senators elected by purple states. So in Montana, for example, Donald Trump will probably be reelected in Montana by double digits, but it's quite likely that Governor Bullock will be the next senator from Montana. That means he will probably govern, probably lead, vote as a senator in a more centrist way than might be the case if we were electing an additional senator, from Hawaii or from Connecticut. So the places that are in play are purple states, not deep blue states. And if we are successful because we elect, Reverend Warnock in Georgia or Sarah Gideon in Maine, it'll be because the country has looked at this moment and said they want Joe Biden to be able to lead, and they want him to have a Senate majority that he can work with.
Or Jamie Harrison in South Carolina.
Or Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, yes.
In the less than 2 minutes that we have left, I'm going to end with this question. After what we've seen over the last 3.5 years of this presidency, and particularly since May 25th, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, what would it say about America if indeed Donald Trump is reelected president of the United States?
Well, Jonathan, I did a call earlier this week through NDI with former Secretary Madeleine Albright, with Michelle Flournoy, who's one of the brightest minds in defense and security policy, and we were talking about the future. There were more than 100 countries represented, their ambassadors or delegates who are here to observe the Democratic National Convention. And it was a reminder to me that the whole world really is watching. If we re-elect President Donald Trump, first, it will send a signal to our partners and allies around the world that we are no longer the reliable champion of human rights, of democracy, of a free press that we have so long been because of President Trump's shameful record of winking at authoritarians and putting his thumb in the eye of our closest allies in democratic countries like Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Second, I think it'll send a bad message to our own children and grandchildren. The tone of former First Lady Michelle Obama's remarks at the convention really focused on this, the way in which the mean-spiritedness, the bullying by President Trump, his conduct in public and on Twitter, the ways in which he's gone after his opponents, both in the Republican Party and in my party, sends a wrong signal to our kids and to our country about how to get ahead, about how to lead. There's not an ounce of humility, graciousness, centeredness to this man. And I think it's important that we show that that's what we value. So a large part of why I've been such an enthusiastic supporter of Joe Biden since he announced is that I know his character, I know his empathy, I know the kindness that I've seen him show to others of all backgrounds. It was Lindsey Graham, who tearfully was quoted in an interview a few years ago saying, "God has made no finer person than Joe Biden." The people who've worked with him in the Senate, the people who've met him just casually in an elevator or on the street, or as he was going to the grocery store after Mass, have come to know him as a man of decency, empathy, and faith in us, faith in our future. If we reelect Donald Trump in this moment, I think it sends exactly the wrong message to the world, to our country, and to history. And if we choose instead to elect Joe Biden, I think we will elect a decent man who has shown kindness and empathy throughout his life, and who has chosen in Kamala Harris, one of my great colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee, a tremendous partner. And in combination, that ticket shows the ways in which we are embracing the future of America, a future that is more inclusive and just, and that has unlimited promise.
Senator Chris Coons, why do I have a feeling that we were just given a giant preview of your remarks tonight? We're going to have to leave it there. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, thank you very much for being on Washington Post Live.
Thank you, Jonathan. Always great to be with you.
And Washington Post Live's convention coverage continues at 3:30 p.m. when my colleague Bob Costa really will be here to interview Senator Bernie Sanders. And then at 4, Karen Tumulty will be back to interview House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. As always, you can head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find more information about upcoming programs. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Have a good afternoon.